This video will cover coaching science behind Alison Becker's training, but first I want to start with this clip discussing Edwin van der Sar, one of the best goalkeepers in football history, and his training routine.
And he would come out to training only probably 3 days a week, right? And I remember on Friday sometimes he would come out, he would literally catch about 3 or 4 volleys, and even then might not catch them, pat them down, and he would sort of squeeze the ball a bit, look at the goalie coach and go, "That's me done." And the goalie coach would go, "Cool," and he would just walk in. Because it was all about Saturday. It was all in his head and he just knew what he was doing.
Yeah. So is goalkeeper training useful? Fabian Otter coaches Alison at Liverpool FC, has a PhD in skill acquisition and works with specialists from around the world in other sports. See, most of coaching science looks at human behaviour, not specific sports. Fabian's recent publication is with 2 NFL specialists, an associate professor in football sports science, and a kinesiology program director. Now, when I think back to when I was playing football as a child, there were loads of cones on the floor and loads of unopposed practice. Dribbling around cones, running through gates of cones, or shooting when I got to a line or after I turned with the ball, even passing in lines or grids without a person getting in the way. I wasn't a goalkeeper, but according to Fabian's research and several hours of me watching goalkeeper practice online, it's all very similar. Not just the grassroots clubs or academy clubs I used to play in, but the higher levels of football coaching and also reaching the top of the game. In this presentation, this training style is described as traditional practice. Training an ideal technique from a textbook, predictable drills for easy repetition, and breaking up tasks into smaller parts for them to be put back together again later, all relying on the expert coach to give feedback and instruction on how to do better. Now, to clarify, there isn't really anything wrong with this. It helps, but what skill acquisition research shows is that there are better ways. If we look at what skills professional goalkeeper coaches think are important, they say athleticism, mentality, technical skill, but also decision making. As Fabian quotes a coach from his study,
"Decision making, because with the wrong decision, the best technique will not work. With the right decision, the worst technique can work."
And to me, good decision-making includes all of those other points. Correctly perceiving whether, when, and how to move relies on you to know what your capabilities are, relies on you to coordinate with everything else that's going on, but also relies on you to be paying attention to useful information. This is where the simple, isolated, unopposed training could be questioned. If Fabian's right and most of practice is unopposed and isolated, how do players learn how to make better decisions? I'm a coaching science nerd, so I like to look at the philosophy and psychology behind our practice design. In 1994, Keith Davids proposed a framework known as Ecological dynamics, which has gained support and traction from various others, both in academic spaces, but also in applied sports roles more recently. Fabian being one example in both camps. Instead of focusing on an ideal technique, the framework encourages exploring different movement solutions, which emerge from the problems set. Problems from the match or game situation, or created by coaches through practice design. It's not saying practice can't or shouldn't be unopposed, but for the practice to be effective, elements should be kept similar or representative of the game. Dribbling a football around cones encourages people to look at their feet. The coach could say look up, but why would a player look up? In a game, the player would be looking at where to dribble or who to pass to, maybe even if they can shoot. Now, if they're dribbling around cones they've been told not to look at, so now they're looking forwards instead so they can no longer see the cones, I think it's a valid question to ask how that would help in a game. This relates back to the assumption that there is an ideal technique to dribbling a ball or fundamentals that need to be learned first. We get good at what we practice, and lined cones aren't on a pitch. So can it help? Well, yes. Can it be more effective? Well, that's where science suggests yes. Add some unpredictable elements to unopposed practice. So instead of dribbling around cones, other people could be dribbling in an area with a ball of their own. maybe add opposition, but constrain the opposition, giving the player with the ball the advantage. Tie the defender's hands behind their back, restricting their movements. Defenders jumping instead of running, again, restricting their movements, slowing them down. Figures 1 and 2 in the paper show some passing practice examples. Dribbling with the ball and passing to a player on the outside of the marked area. It is unopposed, as there isn't anyone trying to get the ball, but players are making decisions, avoiding other players, and picking who to pass to, then following the pass without getting in the way of other people. Figure 2 adds more direction, making the session more representative of a match. Straightforwards. This could be made more complex by allowing interceptions or tackles in that area. Loads of other constraints could be added, but this is where the important question comes in. Does the movement problem contain relevant sources of information for the athletes to regulate their movements? In this case, the movement problem being dribbling without running into moving people instead of static cones. Relevant information sources being moving people instead of static cones. Regulate their movements being different directions, speeds, and timing of when to start and stop dribbling. I've spoken with many coaches that believe you should do unopposed practice first to build up the fundamentals, but as this paper and much of the skill development research that I've read says, coaches should be aware that there is little substantial evidence that unopposed technical practice is required before opposed game-like activities are implemented in their practices. Simplified tasks for desirable difficulty? Yes, but not necessarily unopposed, as mentioned earlier about constraining the opposition to simplify the task. Here, a couple of practice examples from my online browsing session. Now, granted, this is a short, but when do you go down to one knee? How do you know which technique to use and when? What decisions are being made in this practice? As you can see, the goalkeeper gives the other player the ball and starts moving before the ball is even kicked. I'll explore some of those questions later on, but now listen to what this Premier League coach says after the drill explanation.
You come across, I'm coming in here and I'm looking for that. Yeah? Make the save, up, touch, strike. Anywhere. You're trying to score now.
You're trying to score now. The video is cut up and I don't know the full context of the training session because it was 2 hours long, but to me this sounds like the attackers were aiming for the goalkeeper. Similar to Van der Sar's practice catches earlier on, there's not much decision-making there. Here is a different, more recent Premier League example.
Hit those hands, please, you two. Blue! Nice.
Red, go!
Yeah, I like it. Brilliant. Service, Marco. Stop, you two. Yeah, let's travel. Brilliant.
Hit those hands. Then the goalkeeper is shouting out a colour of a cone before a verbal cue to start the drill. I'm intrigued why the cones and shouting, because I'm not sure they are relevant sources of information when you look at a game situation. There are plenty of other examples, but one point mentioned in the paper I want to highlight and emphasise here is about errors. Within the traditional approach as described by Fabian, errors or mistakes are when the desired technique isn't performed. Shoot with your laces is what I was told when I was younger, but I used to find far more success shooting with the side of my foot. The goal of practice was to score, but I wasn't scoring the right way. As the ecological dynamics framework encourages exploring different movement solutions that emerge from the problem, if the problem doesn't encourage a different solution, then there isn't really an error or mistake being made. In a similar sense, trying different solutions in practice helps players to be more adaptable, maybe giving them a different solution to a different problem that might happen during the game. Each player is unique. Pro players will likely have an individualized training plan, or IDP, as Fabian puts it. During my strength and conditioning master's degree, I made hundreds of these things and putting them into periodization plans. But you'll notice broad areas for improvement, not biomechanical or technical errors being made. Laces or inside of the foot. You'll also notice on the left position-specific knowledge. In this case, a goalkeeper in football. On the far right, skill acquisition, training methods and principles. Then in the middle spaces for collaboration of the team to, well, work together. There are loads of other types of these graphics, models, frameworks in sports coaching. I personally prefer to use the definition of effective coaching from Coate and Gilbert in 2009. It goes like this: the consistent application of integrated professional, interpersonal and intrapersonal knowledge to improve athletes' competence, confidence, connection and character in specific coaching contexts. It's much more broad and encompasses more of the sports coaching literature. But the IDP model focuses on specific professional knowledge, the collaboration being subject to the team and sport context, really. And this recent paper then discusses some NFL examples, but Fabian shares some goalkeeper examples in his presentation, which, when we look at, uses the contemporary approach sometimes described as the ecological approach from Keith Davids and Ecological Dynamics. You'll notice each goalkeeper using different ways to block the shot, sometimes moving from their feet to their hands. Also, looking at the attacker to decide which side to block. Then, if we listen to this,
where here we have the topic of cutback situations and dealing with cutbacks, 3 attackers attacking the box, goalkeeper in goal, and we go into the positioning of the goalkeeper and obviously elements of decision making. Do I go and put pressure on the striker? When do I get set? Where do I get set in the space? And how do I try to save the shot?
How do I try to save the shot? The ball not going at their hands. This practice representing a cutback situation, but the movement problem is unpredictable, at a desirable difficulty for the players they're working with. The movement problem also contains relevant sources. There are other attackers and obstacles which can block the view of both the attackers and the goalkeeper. This 2010 study showed that goalkeepers will change what they look at depending on the task, which can negatively impact performance, so static or moving players matters. And then the goalkeeper can also move in any way they think will solve the problem, not a right way, right technique. But Fabian makes a really important point about replicating the game.
Lots of adaptation, and at least try to replicate slices of the game here in patterns, knowing that in this goalkeeping environment, we're never going to replicate the game simply because we don't have enough numbers here.
Irrespective of the sport, we can only do so much to represent the full game. This approach encourages solving variable problems with adaptable solutions, manipulating task constraints to encourage exploration of movement solutions rather than an ideal technique. Nonlinear environments, so lots of different things going on with unpredictable sessions and lots of variability. With low variability training and doses, of course, and the coach acting as a designer of practice rather than an answer machine. Jenny Busick, an MBA coach, has spoken about this variability in practice and how some types of practice just aren't as good. In this video, I share some honest advice she gives about how you could coach your athletes like this.